Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Callie Waterhouse with the Arizona Association of Realtors, and we're thrilled that you have chosen to join us today on this lovely afternoon for part one of our two-part series on solar. Today we're going to be talking about what every realtor and buyer need to know, the 5 most common things buyers need to know about solar. On part 2, we'll be talking about what every realtor and seller needs to know about solar. Today we're thrilled to welcome Liz Recchia to joining us. Liz is our go-to person with all things solar. She's been in the business for about 30 years, offering hands-on experience in all areas of residential real estate, including short sales, REO, probate, traditional sales, and small commercial real estate. Liz is an approved Arizona real estate instructor. She teaches agent and broker pre-licensing classes as well as CE classes. So we're thrilled to welcome Liz today. And in part one, what can you expect? What are we going to learn today? Well, what every realtor and buyer needs to know about solar. So we're going to talk about who owns that solar system. Now, we're not talking about planets and stars. We're talking about that energy efficient system that's on the house that your buyer wants to buy. We're going to talk about the deal makers and the deal breakers. And the first question your buyer should ask: and how do Senate Bills 1465 and 1417 affect their sales and your buyers? And then we're going to talk about utility bill savings and what else every buyer needs to consider. In part 2, we're going to talk about what every realtor and seller needs to know about solar. And if you missed part 1 or part 2, no worries. Today's webinar is recorded and will be available on our website at aaronline.com.
You should have a copy of the handout of our clients. So this little great piece is something that I think is very handy, and you should be able to easily put that on your tablet or your laptop or even print it off and hand it to your buyers. I like to hand it to buyers. I think that physical paper and that physical act of walking through it in paper really helps them sink into the questions and the resources that they should be thinking about. Okay, so let's start with what I think should be the first question a buyer asks. What is a solar system? What does it cost to maintain? And how long does it last? That should be the very first question our buyer's asking. Buyers get so excited about the money that they'll save on monthly bills, but do they really understand the energy system they are purchasing and the cost to keep that system in good repair so the energy keeps flowing? I mean, let's face it, if you have panels on your roof and dirt gets on the panels, there's no sunlight coming through. If there's no sunlight coming through, there's no energy coming through. Do they understand even that most basic concept? Do they realize there's more to rooftop solar than the panels they see on the roof? Do they realize that the energy panels capture needs to be converted into a usable energy, and that requires an inverter? Most people, even with a solar system, when I go to take a listing on a house, they will not realize they have an inverter. They don't understand that system. Do they realize that while the panels have an average lifespan of 15 to 20 years, that inverter has a lifespan of about 7 to 10 years? Now we're not going, we're not proceeding. I don't know. Click on the screen. There he goes. Way back. There we go. Sorry about that. So in this illustration, you can tell we have the panels and then we have that inverter. That's what converts that solar energy into the usable energy you can use in your house. And most buyers and most sellers don't even realize they have that. So now we're talking about a basic maintenance issue. You're going to have to replace that inverter about halfway through the solar panel lifetime. So when we get through with all this, how about some other initial questions? And we've already talked about what happens when the panels get dirty, but there's more than that. How about if there's damage caused by wind or hail? Who's going to fix that? Who's going to repair those panels? Who's going to take the panels off the roof so you can repair the roof, so then put the panels back on? And there's a reasonable possibility that sometime in that 20 years that the roof may actually need to be repaired. So even if there's not damage from a storm, you might get a roof leak and you might need to have a roof repair. Who's going to, once again, take the panels off, put them back on? depending upon who they purchased their system through, they may have a contract that says they are personally, the homeowner is responsible for that replacement, or they may have a contract that says the utility company or the solar company is responsible for that. So what is it they're buying? They need to read their contract very carefully. So what about the performance of the system over time versus the loan or the lease payments? Solar panels don't perform at the same level in year 1 as they do in year 11, and certainly not the same in year 15. So performance goes down over time. But if the system is leased or purchased with a loan, most of the time, that's a graduated payment, and the payments go up over time while the performance goes down. So we're talking about payments increasing while performance goes down. So these are the type of disclosures your buyers need to know if they're buying whether they're buying a new solar system or they're buying a resale house with a solar system already on it. So they need to read that solar contract, and they need to read that solar contract with a critical eye towards how that impacts the deal. Is it a deal maker for them, or is it a deal breaker? And the question is for them. Someone else may be fine with those terms, but maybe not for them. These types of questions go to disclosures, and disclosures are what our buyers need and our sellers most likely won't know. But all of those are so important. So how do our buyers get these and other disclosures? Traditionally, it's been really difficult, if not impossible. After all, how many of our sellers can tell a buyer what the future performance of the solar panels will be? How about the transferability of the lease or the loan, or the assumability of the loan? If the lease and loan can't be transferred or assumed by the future home buyer, well, might that impact the buyer's decision to buy? How about if the solar contract can only be transferred a limited number of times and your buyer is the second to last person eligible to take over the contract? Might that encumbrance be concerning to your buyer, particularly if they don't think they're going to stay in the house as long as the term of that loan or lease? Or how about if the contract can be transferred or the loan assumed, and under what conditions? Does the buyer need a particular FICO score, and is there a transfer fee? And who pays that fee? Well, in the spring of 2015, AAR's legislative representative, Nicola Slavic, was able to get resales added to Bill SB 1465. And SB 1465 was originated by home builders and utility companies to address these issues because solar companies were representing certain utility savings and performances, but leaving it to the home builders and the utilities to answer the consumers' questions. It was really important to us here at AAR that the correct party be tasked with the responsibility of proper disclosure, and that is the solar companies. They are the best place to get those disclosures since it's their contract and their systems. And this was huge because as of January 1st of 2016, solar companies must now provide a dedicated representative to provide proper disclosures and forms and gather signatures and follow escrow all the way through to closing so that both buyers and sellers have all the necessary disclosure information. At this point, I want to mention that I have put together a resource document, and it contains legislation and articles and handouts and anything that I find might help agents and their clients find the answers they need. So after this webinar, I'll be sending you a link to that resource page, and I do update it occasionally, so just check back every once in a while to see if there's anything new on it. So even with SB 1465, buyers of solar were still complaining that they had signed contracts not really realizing some of the terms. One of the issues was that the sales presentation didn't match the contract terms, and people signed up based on the sales transaction. And should we really be surprised that they didn't read their solar contract? After all, we know they don't read the contract on the mortgage on their house, so why would we expect them to read that solar contract? The other two big issues that kept being heard were fees, all sorts of add-on fees, and blank spaces in the contract being filled in after the buyer had signed the contract. So in the 2016 legislative session, SB 1417 was passed. It mandates a minimum 2-year warranty on any distributed energy system, and that does include solar. Components and installation must be warranted for at least 1 year. The written warranty must include performance information, and fees must be fully disclosed. And best of all, no blank spaces left in the contract at the time of buyer's signature. My favorite item, though, was the sales presentation must match the contract information. Here are some of the other items covered in this bill. 1, it requires an interconnection application to be approved by the utility, and those of you who have had people try to interconnect and find out that their system is not compatible with their utility know how important this was. 2, requires the application disclose the owner of the system. 3, establishes the contractor requirements, which they had never had contractor requirements. So now the register of contractors here in the state can go after people who aren't proper contractors for this type of work. 4, prohibits payments from starting until the system's actually interconnected and energized. 5, requires the written warranty to be part of the finance and lease agreement. 6, provides the buyer or lessee can rescind the agreement at least 3 business days after signing and prior to installation. And 7, requires the total price to the buyer over the life of the agreement be stated. 8, provides that a notice of all interest, installation fees, dock prep fees, service fees, all other fees and costs that are paid by the buyer must be made up front. 9, the agreement must state the total number of payments, payment frequency, amount of payment, and the payment due date. 10, requires documents and sales presentations suggesting savings substantiate the methodology they use to calculate the savings. They can no longer just wing it and tell you you're going to have great savings. They have to tell you how they derived that savings calculation. 11, provides that the written warranty be part of the finance or the lease agreement. These are just a few of the 18 items covered in SB 1417, and it became law on August 6th, just a few weeks ago. As the resource document, it's in the resource document I told you about just a little while ago. Now let's turn to our attention to the buyer's ability to purchase a house with solar. What loan or appraisal issues have you run into, and can you type your responses in your box? Got any loan or
So let's start back with how many of our members who are listening to our webinar have had a transaction that included solar panels? So let's start there. And we do have a couple of questions from before. Is there a difference between who owns the solar system if installed on a new home versus a resale home that added solar later? Janine would like to know.
Is a difference in...
Is there a difference between who owns the solar system if installed?
It depends on, the question you want to ask is who owns the solar system. So who did they buy the solar system from? A new house versus a resale house, they still could have bought it from either a solar company or a utility. And so that's a basic question in the new home center you want to be asking. Who is my buyer buying this system from? A utility or a solar company?
Okay, so we have a couple of responses. So we've had quite a few people who have had transactions with solar. That's great. Looks like we've had a few that have had cash deals.
Okay, that takes out some of the headaches.
Yes. One that fell through because the owner ended up walking away.
Yeah, okay.
Michelle has represented 2 sales with solar. One was owned and one was a prepaid lease.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, Jenny says she had one, but looks like it got canceled because the buyer was not able to qualify or to assume the lease.
Yeah.
It looks like the assumption of the lease is quite a...
Yeah, can a lease be transferred or can a loan be assumed? Those are 2 biggest hiccups a lot of time. And even if they prepay the lease, it may not be transferable even at that. Right. So yeah, let's look at some of these basic issues. And that gets us back to the basic question of who owns that solar system. And right now, at this day and time, there's basically 5 scenarios you're going to see. The first one is the utility owns the equipment and pays a lease to the homeowner. The second one is the utility company owns the equipment and the homeowner pays them a lease. The third is the solar company owns the equipment and the homeowner pays them a lease. And the fourth one is the homeowner owns the equipment but has an outstanding loan. And the fifth one is the homeowner owns the system and there's no debt. That would be our favorite.
That would be nice.
Given these scenarios, we need to be asking, what questions do we want our buyers to be asking? And those of you who have had transactions, you probably have several questions you wish your buyers had asked, starting with the actual definition of who owns this system, because boy, does that change some of your answers. So do you have any other questions you wished your buyer had asked initially?
Ron says that they were able to assume the system as owners, but any maintenance was their responsibility as well.
Back to that contract. Yeah, what does that contract say? And here's the thing. Those solar contracts, at one point, it seemed to me like they were changing almost daily. So you could be selling a house on Tuesday with a particular solar company or utility, and you would go in to speak to a buyer or seller the next day, and that contract looked completely different. Those contracts are evolutionary and they change very rapidly. So do not assume that a client who had a contract with one company and you knew what that contract said, that it says the same thing for your next client. They change all the time, and that's key. Once again, know the guts of that contract. So the first question of who owns the solar system is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, that solar panels are considered personal property by home loan lenders. We have to realize that. Although we think of them as a fixed and we think they're attached to the house, and they are physically, a home loan lender is going to consider them personal property. And because of this, the lease systems are not acceptable to some of the lenders. FHA comes to mind. In the FHA guidelines, they actually state that they will not insure loans on leased systems. So even if a client prepays the lease, it doesn't help you because it's still a leased system if you have an FHA buyer. So if you have a buyer who's FHA and wants solar, then you know right up front you don't want to be showing them houses with leased solar systems on them. Going along with the loan question is, how long will it take the buyer to recapture the amount spent? For those of you who have never calculated a recapture, here's a quick and simple little example. So suppose you have an estimated energy usage of the home of $150 a month without solar, and it's $100 a month with solar. So your buyer is saving $50 a month if they put on solar. If your buyer pays $15,000 to install that solar system, then how many months will it take that buyer to recapture based on the savings per month, that initial $15,000 investment? And so you're going to quickly just do that $50 savings divided into that $15,000 cost. And what you're going to get is 300 months or 25 years. So now the question to your buyer is, do you want to go ahead and buy a system where, in this particular case, Mr. Buyer, it may take you 25 years to recoup your initial your initial cost, and you haven't even bought that, remember, second inverter somewhere around year 10. So is that what you want to do, Mr. Buyer? It also leads you to look at the contract. Is there a provision in the contract that provides for some of that upkeep, like maybe a new inverter? Maybe that influences the buyer's decisions. So that basic calculation needs to be done by the buyer. And then there's the question of the buyer's DTI, their debt to income ratio. If your buyer is going to assume a loan or lease, will they still qualify to purchase that house? Has that assumption of the new debt through the solar purchase, has it thrown off their loan approval? And if you are dealing with clients who are just barely qualifying on that DTI, assuming that loan or transferring that lease to them may throw them out of the ability to qualify to buy that house at all. So what are the trade-offs that your buyer needs to consider? Because this could be a new home or resale home, but given some of these scenarios, what are some of those trade-offs you may have to have a discussion with your buyer? And have you had that discussion before? So think about having a buyer and they want to buy solar. They've decided this is something they want. but they just found out that they're not going to be able to qualify to buy that house if it has, because of the price point of that solar system being absorbed into their DTI. What conversation do you have with your buyer? How about, Mr. Buyer, have you considered buying a smaller house so you can have the solar? If your buyer is bent on solar because it's a value to them, then the trade-off may be they buy a smaller house or they buy in a different neighborhood so they can have that solar. It's of such importance to them, that's what they want. The other conversation is, Mr. Buyer, if you do buy this, it may impact some of the other things you've told me you wanted. You wanted to be able to put $300 a month into a savings account for your kids' college. If you absorb this solar loan or this solar lease, then your family budget will be impacted. You may not be able to save $300 a month. You may be able to save 0 or 100 or whatever that number is. Are you willing to make that trade-off, Mr. Buyer? Is that something you want to do? How is this going to change your family goals, financial goals long term? Those are questions our buyers need to ask themselves, and they can ask themselves before you ever show them a house.
Ron says that he has had the conversation with his buyer that there are other energy saving alternatives that they can look at.
Absolutely, and that is exactly what we need to be doing. So imagine you have a new home buyer, and they're on the fence about purchasing that solar system offered by the builder. Even though the buyer is purchasing a house that maximizes their pre-approved loan amount, the builder assures them they can still purchase the solar system and roll it into their loan. So they're maxed out on their loan amount, but the new home builder is saying, oh, don't worry, you can still buy our solar house and we can wrap that cost of solar on top of your existing loan approval. So your buyer's going to ask your advice, and what do you say to them? Have any of you had this?
Read the contract.
Read the contract. And ask them again, why do you want your solar? Is it value or money savings? That starts the conversation. But our biggest question is, so how can that builder assure the buyer of a higher loan amount than the appraisal or the approval? That's a real basic question. But the reason they can do that is there's something called an energy efficient mortgage. And that allows the buyer to add the amount of approved energy efficient systems or upgrades to their home loan. So if the buyer's qualified for a $100,000 loan and purchases a $15,000 solar system, this program would allow it to be a $115,000 loan. So at this point, you might be wanting to remind your buyer of the area comps, because there's a really good possibility that, particularly with our less than 20% down buyers, they will be closing escrow in a negative equity position. And so then the question is, Mr. Buyer, are you okay with being underwater when you're with your house the day you close escrow? So on the other hand, this brings us back to other energy efficient things that can be done, as was just mentioned. There might be new energy savings technology that's more affordable and still allows for substantial energy savings. And I'm thinking right now of things like the solar roof tiles, or 3M's new window film, which cuts the energy loss by as much as 90%. Or how about fencing with the solar overlay? Or replacing old windows with new windows, or caulking around doors and windows and outlets, increasing the insulation in the walls and ceilings. Not only can these types of improvements be included in the energy efficient mortgage, but some cities will give your homeowner a grant to pay for this work. And these grants don't have to be paid back. So Mr. Buyer, you need to be looking into your city that you're looking at buying into, and perhaps they have a grant that will allow you to upgrade with something, and you don't necessarily have to go in upside down on your house. You can do other energy efficient improvements that will get you the grant, get you the energy efficiency, and might fit into your budget better. All this leads us to buyers agents urging their buyers to ask these questions before even showing them houses or even new builds. If your buyer doesn't want to be upside down, then that changes the houses you show to them. And how many of you have had buyers who ask the seller for their energy bill? So they just want to verify that energy usage. And I know I have, and I've cautioned my buyers that even if the seller provides them with copies of their bills, each person uses energy differently, and utility plans and charges change over time. And this is especially true with solar sellers. Here's an example. Last April, I was speaking with a potential seller, and she had a solar system owned by SRP and placed on the house in 2009. Back then, utility companies were trying to get as much solar up as possible, as fast as possible, in order to meet President Obama's clean energy mandates. And her deal says SRP pays for maintenance of the system, pays her a lease fee in the form of a credit on her monthly bill, and she's guaranteed that she will never pay more than $124 a month. Problem is that that deal is only good for her. When the house transfers through sale or inheritance, the new owner pays according to the current rates. And if you have a buyer interested in her house, getting a copy of her bill will be useless to you. In addition to the mechanical and maintenance and loan questions, I like to ask buyers to think long-term about the utility companies and the energy sector. I ask them, what do you think will happen at the Corporation Commission when it comes to demand fees and net metering and grid access fees? Do you think these fees might significantly offset your savings? And that's something your buyers have to research and decide for themselves. So you can give them sources like the Corporation Commission, who has a plethora of information on their cases currently pending and past. And then there's the reality of utilities changing the way they produce energy and their cost. In Arizona, we're the home to the world's largest solar power plant. And it's right down there between Gila Bend and Yuma. I'm sure you've passed it if you've gone out I-8 towards San Diego. That plant produces energy at a lower cost than individual installations can do. NV Energy in Nevada has a third of its energy coming from both wind and solar very inexpensively, and that percentage is growing. Back east, companies are starting to harvest energy from road and bridge vibrations, and they're using it for light and heat. So now the question is, do you think, Mr. Buyer, you're purchasing a power system that will serve you well for 20 years? Or are you buying old technology? Now, let's think about companies like 21st Century Power and Green Mountain in Vermont. They're completely changing what a utility company is and what it looks like. These companies offer more than just energy to your home or office. They offer financing for energy products as well. So products from appliances to Tesla cars. And if these models take off, retail energy may soon look more like a cell phone business, with each customer purchasing the equipment and services they want individually from the company they choose. So think about that as a difference in the way we buy energy and the way we look at utilities. The buyer needs to determine, do they think the utility model is changing? And if so, how quickly and in what ways? And yes, that may mean they need to do a little more reading before they make that decision. None of us knows what the future holds, but change is happening, so buyers need to consider all of this, because next to the house, energy is the next long-term decision that they could encumber that house for as long or longer than the home loan. So think about a buyer who gets a 15-year mortgage but leases a solar system for 20 years. So today we've discussed a few of the issues buyers need to consider when trying to decide if they should purchase a house with solar. If you're interested in more information, I do teach a 3-hour CE class on solar, and you can check that description out at www.wsreschoolofrealestate.com. And look for me for my email at sometime in the next few days with that resource link. I think we can all agree helping our clients get the information from the solar company and providing clients with the tools to access correct information, helping them ask necessary questions of the right person, and guiding them through this process will help clients participate and understand their actions have consequences. It'll also help them understand the transaction, and that's what they're completing when they're with you and me. They're completing a transaction with long-term consequences. And understanding that is good for you, it's good for your agents, it's good for buyers, it's good for sellers. To extend the learning, I encourage you to connect with me on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or my blog at www.thekitchentableadvisor.com. And once again, you can listen to this again by going to AAR's website at aaronline.com. I also invite you to join me for my next webinar on solar. It'll be this Thursday, August 18th. This webinar will cover sellers and some of the issues that listing agents face. It's been a real pleasure today putting on this webinar. I'm honored that you chose to invest your time with me and AAR today. And I hope next time you have a buyer who asks you about seller, you'll have more tools in your tool bag to help you help your buyer make their best decision.
Great. Well, thank you so very much, Liz. Now, we do have some questions.
Great.
And just going to put up on your screen what you can expect on Thursday. So the very first question comes from BG, and BG wants to know, do you know of any lenders with a loan product for 100% solar home that's off the grid?
Wow.
I would love to see this home personally.
Well, and the biggest challenge with being off the grid a lot of times is the storage of that energy. So you don't see those very often. I do not know anybody off the top of my head who does. I would say your best bet, given the current financing market, is that you go into the private lending sector. Those guys are very progressive in their loans. And a lot of them, if you can make a case for why this is a good loan and there's good value there, they will go ahead and do it. So fortunately, we live in Maricopa County, and we have a ton of private lenders. And these are sometimes either one guy or they're a group of guys who went in together, and that's what they do. So I would be looking into that private financing market. That may be your best bet. And don't think that's all like hard money. It's not. They have long-term loans, they have short-term loans, they have reasonable fees, and they have good interest rates, the ones that I've experienced. If you shop around, it may take a little shopping for your buyer, but you can certainly find these private lenders with good interest rates and good down payment terms.
Excellent. And then Michelle noted that she had heard that the FHA loan guidelines for solar are changing or had changed.
Well, the ones I put up are the most recent. That's what's in print right now. The problem we're having with FHA is it was unclear to lenders. And so you have lenders who are lending on lease systems. And if you've been talking to some of your lenders who have gone and talked to the folks in Santa Ana recently, there's a real conflict right now between lenders and Fannie Mae and the Santa Ana office in particular. At first, Santa Ana was not going to relent on this, and that was a problem because a lot of lenders had already made those loans on lease systems. But the friction and that number of loans that are happening, although they have not altered their written guidelines, we'll see what they do. And right now, the last I heard about 3 weeks ago from a lender I know who is constantly in contact with Santa Ana, they were not relenting on this. So all I can say is you need to be relying on your lenders, and if it changes, know that changes. My point with putting up that paragraph was that that's what's in writing right now. So the question for you as an agent or broker is, do you really want to play in this, from my point of view, minefield where where FHA is in conflict with its own lenders and they're trying to hash it out right now? I personally thinking I don't want to put my buyer in that situation where they may look at this, think they get a loan, and then the rug gets pulled out from underneath them. So what's in writing is what I have gone by. But if you and your broker decide you want to take a chance and your buyer's okay with it, then that's what you can do. But just know what's in writing.
Okay, and then our next question is, do you know if the APS is going to continue giving the credit?
Are you talking about the tax credit? Is that what you're referring to, the individual tax credits?
Yeah.
Okay, so right now it appears that tax credits are going to be lessening over time, and that has more to do with the federal government than it does to have to do with the utility companies or the solar companies, because the tax credits are a federal program, and they have announced that they are weaning down on those, which is why you're starting to see solar companies changing what they look like and some of the deals they're doing, as well as the utility companies. So right now I'd say you need to anticipate, and your buyer needs to anticipate, that tax credit may be going away. I would strongly suggest they find a CPA who is very good at solar and the solar industry, particularly if you're in the commercial world, because those tax credits in the commercial world are an asset, and they can buy, sell, and trade those in whole or in part. So right now it looks like some of the individual tax credits will be going away. Not sure that's really true on the commercial side, because they really want to bump up the commercial. But if you have a buyer, and I don't know if your buyer is commercial or residential, you want to have them talking to a CPA who's very experienced in this field.
Mike mentions a billing credit from feedback into grid.
So this is from a credit on the homeowner's bill that's being issued from the solar company or the utility. Is that correct?
Does that sound right, Mike? Mike is furiously typing. Yes.
Okay. So your question is that diminishing?
Yes.
Okay, you're going to have to look at your utility or your solar company. For some of the utilities, they no longer give those credits on the bill. So that's back to, I may have an SRP buyer or seller like I had in April, who has the solar system that she bought in 2009, and that has a credit, but I can go out tomorrow and have an SRP customer, and they don't have that credit because they bought it 5 years later. It didn't exist in that contract, or they bought it last year. So once again, it is very contract specific, and it really depends on what period of time they bought that system in, because remember, all of that was incentivized by what was coming out of Washington, D.C.
Excellent. All right, and then Ron mentions that, we mentioned storage a little bit. So what is the forecast for battery storage for solar, and is that in the near term, or is it still kind of far off?
So as I look at some of these battery storage systems, there's some pretty exciting new technology coming out in the battery world, to the point where we just had an announcement last week from a couple of companies that they think that their battery storage systems could be up and running and able to store a full house worth of energy overnight in the short term, in the next year to 18 months. The question is, are they right on that estimate? And your buyer's going to have to research that if they want to know what that battery storage is, and then the cost of that battery storage. Remember, new technology is more expensive than that technology a few years later.
And are you hearing of any new incentives being offered?
Right now, I don't have any new incentives that I can think of. As the utility models change, then we're going to start seeing that from the utility model changes. So that's what I'm seeing from back east.
And what about, are you hearing anything out there maybe about a grid access fee?
Yeah, that's been talked about. If you go to the Corporation Commission, that is absolutely something that has been argued. In fact, 2 weeks ago, they just came down and ruled on one of those decisions from one of the utility companies in southern Arizona. So you want to be really accessing your Corporation Commission website to keep on top of those access fees and those net metering fees.
Excellent. All right, so on the screen, you're going to see what we're going to talk about on Thursday, what every realtor and seller needs to know about solar, and I would assume that this is going to be a very detailed, in-depth conversation.
Yeah,
so
it will be.
Liz is going to be talking about SB 1465 and 1470 and how it helps sellers sell their homes, and why your most likely buyer may not be able to buy that particular house. And what did you do? Let's talk about the questions we should all be asking, and how sellable is the listing, and then the changing energy market, which, having driven to California recently,
yeah,
it seems like things are constantly changing. That this is a hot topic, but there's always so much change.
It's amazing how fast it's changing. Yes.
You would think living in Arizona that we would be right on top of all of this.
We're in the middle of it to some degree, yes.
We're in the middle of it. So if you have any questions, here's Liz's contact information. You can reach her at liz@wesellrealestate.com. And of course, remember that all of our webinars are recorded and available online. So we're excited about that. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you had your questions answered. Of course, if you have more questions, feel free to email them to me and we'll be able to get them answered for you. Liz, any closing remarks?
Just, I hope that this has helped you have questions that you can help your buyers find the sources of the answers and have them ask. So I hope it helps you with your transactions.
Thank you very much and have a great day.